Lily Hart stood in the parlor of the small ranch house, the flickering light from the oil lamp casting long shadows on the wooden floor. Her fingers trembled as she held the eviction notice, the cold, harsh words staring back at her. The ink seemed to burn into her skin. The small homestead that had been her family's for generations was no longer hers. The land that had been her father who had passed 3 years ago, was about to be taken from her. She could already hear the sound of hooves in the distance. Her heart pounded, but she couldn't look away from the letter in her hands. James Hartwell stood across the room, his tall, broad figure almost filling the doorway. He was a man of few words, his cold eyes scanning the room like he was assessing every inch of it, looking for something. His hands rested casually on his hips, but there was a certain hardness to his posture. He had always been like that, distant, unapproachable. And today, standing in her parlor with her father's legacy in his hands, he seemed like nothing more than a looming storm. "This land belonged to my father," Lily whispered, her voice breaking under the weight of the words. Her father had worked this land with his bare hands, pouring his life into it, and now it was slipping through her fingers like sand. James's voice was flat, emotionless. "Your father's dead 3 years. The land's mine now." He leaned against the doorway, his eyes not meeting hers. "Unless you marry me." Lily's breath caught in her throat. The room felt like it was closing in around her. She stared at him, her mind racing. This wasn't real. He couldn't be serious. "Marry you." The words felt foreign in her mouth, a bitter taste that made her stomach turn. James remained silent, his gaze cold and distant. He didn't offer an explanation, didn't show any sign of emotion. To him, it was business. But to Lily, it was everything. The land was her father's legacy, her home, the only thing she had left to hold on to. How could he ask this of her? How could he make this demand after everything she had lost? She wanted to scream, to throw the letter in his face, to refuse him with every ounce of her being. But there was a tight knot in her chest, a realization that she couldn't escape. Without this marriage, she would lose everything. "Why?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper, but it was laced with disbelief. "Why would you ask me this?" James met her gaze for the first time, and there was something in his eyes, something that hinted at pain, regret, or perhaps a fear he wasn't ready to face. But then it was gone, replaced by that familiar coldness. He didn't answer. His silence was the answer. "I'll give you until tomorrow," he added, his voice steady, almost clinical. "1 month until foreclosure. If you don't marry me, the land is mine." Lily couldn't breathe. She felt like the ground had been ripped from beneath her. She wanted to ask him how he could be so heartless, how he could play with her father's memory like this. But she couldn't. Instead, she held the letter up, her heart heavy. "Please," she whispered, the words barely audible. "Please don't take my home." James's expression didn't soften, but for a brief moment, there was a flicker of something. Maybe guilt, maybe something else. But it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. "Then marry me," he said again, the words simple, direct. No warmth, no affection, just an ultimatum. Lily stood frozen in place, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She had never imagined this kind of life for herself, never thought she'd be faced with such a choice. And yet, here she was on the edge of losing everything. Her home, her father's land, everything she knew. Her eyes welled up with tears, but she refused to let them fall. This wasn't the time to be weak. She had to think. She had to find a way out of this mess. But the longer she stood there, the more the realization set in. There was no way out. Not without James's help. The scene shifted to 6 months earlier. It was the day of her father's funeral. The sky had been heavy with clouds, the air thick with the scent of rain, but there had been no rain. Just the emptiness of a small town cemetery, the ground freshly turned. Lily had stood alone at the gravesite, her father's body now laid to rest beside her mother's. The two had worked this land together, building a life from the ground up. And now, Lily stood alone, her hands clenched in fists by her sides, staring down at the freshly dug earth. The funeral had been small. No one from the town had come to pay their respects. Not that Lily had expected them to. Her father had always been a quiet man, a man who preferred the solitude of his land to the company of others. But now, standing there at the graveside, Lily could feel the weight of her family's history pressing down on her. The land they had worked so hard to build, the crops that had failed year after year, the debts that had piled up despite her father's best efforts. The bank officer had come to the funeral. He had stood there, his presence as cold as the weather, handing her the papers that would seal her fate. 3 months to pay, he had said, his tone indifferent. Or we take the land. Lily's heart had broken then, but she hadn't shed a single tear. Instead, she had made a vow. Standing at her father's grave, she had promised to fight, to never give up. She would save their home, no matter the cost. But as she stared down at the letter in her hands now, she realized how foolish that vow had been. She had tried. She had fought for months, scraping together whatever she could. But it wasn't enough. Nothing was enough. And now James Hartwell stood before her, offering her a lifeline in exchange for her soul. In the days that followed, Lily's desperation grew. She had worked tirelessly, selling vegetables and chickens in town, hoping that someone would show mercy, that someone would see her struggle and offer help. But the townspeople's pity had only fueled the gossip. Clayton Brennan, one of the town's most unscrupulous men, had even made crude advances, offering to pay off her debts in exchange for a favor. She had rejected him violently, refusing to be bought. But the pressure had only mounted, and with it, her sense of helplessness. It wasn't until the storm came that Lily and James would cross paths for the first time. The storm had come on a night that seemed as though the heavens themselves had decided to break. The wind howled through the trees, and the rain battered the roof with such force that Lily thought it might collapse. She had been alone, trying to patch up the roof when the lightning struck. The barn had caught fire, and the horses were trapped inside. She had been in the middle of trying to rescue them when James Hartwell had appeared, riding his horse through the storm like a ghost. Without a word, he had helped her drag the horses to safety, his hands steady, his presence commanding. Sitting in the mud, watching the barn burn, they had exchanged only a few words. But in that moment, something had shifted. Lily had seen something in James's eyes. A glimmer of humanity, something buried beneath the layers of cold indifference. He had ridden away that night without a word, but as she watched him disappear into the storm, Lily couldn't help but wonder, what had he really come for? The next day, Moses had come to her with the news. James Hartwell now owned her debt, and with it, her life was in his hands. James Hartwell's discovery that he owned Lily's debt came as a shock to him, but it also stirred something within him, something he hadn't expected. It was business as usual, a transaction, just another piece of land to add to his growing empire. The bank had sold the debt to him, and he had the right to claim her land and the creek that ran through it. But as he watched her work tirelessly day after day, struggling to keep her father's legacy alive, something shifted. He had seen the fire in her eyes, the fierce determination that reminded him of the woman he had once loved. He had buried his feelings deep after Elizabeth's death, building walls around his heart, but Lily made him feel again, and it unsettled him. Moses, his trusted ranch hand, had seen the change in him too. "What are you planning?" Moses asked one afternoon, catching James staring at Lily as she worked the land. James didn't answer, but the question gnawed at him. He had a cold plan in his mind, to take the land, get the water rights, and be done with it. But every time he saw her, every time he watched her struggle, something within him made that plan feel hollow. So, he rode out to her property one morning at dawn, his mind made up, but his heart not entirely sure. When he arrived at her ranch, she was already working in the field, her back bent under the weight of the day's chores. "I own your debt, Miss Hart," James said, his voice firm but betraying a hint of something else, something uncertain. Lily's eyes widened in shock, the reality of her situation sinking in. She had tried everything, and now there was no way out. "You have 1 month until foreclosure," he continued. "If you don't marry me, the land is mine." The word struck Lily like a blow to the chest. She stood there, unable to respond immediately, her world crumbling around her. She had expected many things from James Hartwell: cruelty, indifference, but never this. "Please don't take my home," she whispered, the words thick with desperation. James didn't flinch. His next words were cold, precise, businesslike. "Then marry me." The words hung in the air between them, shocking in their finality. Lily recoiled, her mind struggling to process the offer. She could hardly believe what she was hearing. Marriage, an arrangement, a business transaction. It didn't make sense, but made sense all too well. Her father's land, her home, was slipping away, and this was the only way to keep it. She wasn't foolish enough to believe that James wanted her. No, he wanted the land, the creek, the resources. This wasn't about love, it was about survival. The terms were simple: a marriage of convenience, nothing more. She would remain in the house, manage the household, and in return, he would allow her to keep the land for a year. After that, they would annul the marriage, and she would be free. It wasn't much of a choice, but it was the only choice she had left. James had made it clear that he would not force her into anything more than what was strictly necessary. The thought of playing the role of a wife, pretending that this marriage was anything more than a business arrangement, made Lily's stomach turn. "I'm not for sale," she had cried, throwing him out of the house in a fit of rage. But even as the door slammed behind him, she knew it was no use. The storm had come, and there was no escaping it. The debt was hers, and James had made sure that she had no way out. The next few days were a blur of tears, frustration, and helplessness. Alone in the parlor, Lily counted the small sums of money she had left, but it was nowhere near enough. Her father's belongings lay untouched around her, reminders of a life now lost. But Moses, ever the faithful friend, came to visit, offering what little he had. "Your father would want you safe, not proud," he had said, his voice gentle but firm. Lily had refused his offer, tears streaming down her face. But eventually, as dawn broke and the first light of morning filled the room, she knew what she had to do. She had to fight. She couldn't let pride stand in the way of her survival. So, with a heavy heart and a final, bitter vow to her father's memory, she mounted her horse and rode to Hartwell Ranch. She was going to accept his terms. She had no choice. When she arrived, James was waiting for her on the porch, his expression unreadable. "I have conditions," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her heart. Her terms were simple. Her father's grave would remain untouched. She would continue to work the land, and no one would know that the marriage was a farce. James agreed without hesitation, save for one condition. She could not continue working herself to the bone. But Lily had no intention of letting her father's land slip away without a fight. And so, with a handshake that felt as cold as the contract itself, they were bound together by circumstance. The wedding would take place in 1 week, and Lily's life would never be the same again. The news of the marriage spread quickly through the town with mixed reactions. Some saw her as a gold digger, others as a woman with no other choice. But Clayton Brennan, the local troublemaker, was furious. His public humiliation was only the beginning of the drama that was about to unfold. Rosa, the housekeeper at Hartwell Ranch, revealed to Lily the truth about James's past. His first wife, Elizabeth, had died years ago, along with their child. James had been a shell of a man since, building his empire as a way to bury his grief. Lily's heart ached for him. But she also realized that this man she was about to marry, was haunted by a loss she could never fully understand. And yet, she was now bound to him, her future uncertain. The wedding was in 3 days. Lily wondered if she was walking into a cage of her own making. The day of the wedding arrived with a crisp, cloudless sky, but for Lily, the air felt suffocating, heavy with the weight of what was happening. She stood before the judge in a borrowed dress, her heart pounding as she nervously fidgeted with the fabric. James Hartwell, in his formal suit, stood beside her, looking every bit the distant, emotionless figure he had always been. The ceremony was short, a mere formality, and when it was over, the words "I do" felt hollow. James spoke them with no warmth, no affection, and neither did Lily. Her thoughts were jumbled, her mind a whirlwind of confusion, anger, and disbelief. As the judge declared them husband and wife, she couldn't shake the feeling of dread that clung to her. The kiss was brief, mechanical, and when their lips parted, neither of them seemed to know what to say. The reception that followed was an awkward social obligation, with townsfolk eyeing them from a distance, their murmurs and whispers hanging in the air like an invisible fog. The men watched James with a mix of envy and suspicion, while the women eyed Lily with a mixture of curiosity and judgment. Clayton Brennan, clearly drunk, couldn't resist making a scene, taunting James with a bitter remark. "Bought yourself a wife, Hartwell?" he slurred. James's response was sharp, his voice cold and dangerous, warning Clayton not to speak about his wife again. The possessiveness in his tone took both of them by surprise, but it didn't soften the tension that still hung in the air. That night, Lily retreated to her new room, the guest room, her eyes wide and unsettled as she stared at the ceiling, her thoughts racing. She could hear James pacing in the study next door, his footsteps echoing through the house like a clock ticking away her chances of ever finding peace in this new life. She didn't know what she had expected, but this wasn't it. The following days were filled with awkward silences, strained politeness at the breakfast table, and a growing realization that neither of them knew how to play the part they were supposed to. Lily tried to find her place in the grand house, but it felt like a foreign world, one she didn't belong in. Rosa, the housekeeper, was kind enough to show her the ropes of managing the household, but Lily's heart wasn't in it. She still sneaked away to her old property when she could, her mind haunted by the life she had lost. James, for his part, barely spoke to her unless it was necessary, and when he did, it was in that same cold, distant manner. The only thing that connected them was the silent understanding that their marriage was a farce, nothing more than a business arrangement. It wasn't until James caught her working on her old land that things started to unravel. He had ridden out to the property, his anger flaring when he found her there, covered in dirt, working like she had before the marriage. "You're my wife now. Act like it," he snapped, his voice filled with frustration. Lily's temper flared. "I'm not your possession," she shot back. His jaw clenched, and he stepped closer. "You're living in my house, bearing my name." His voice was low, almost threatening. She shot him a look of defiance. "By contract only. This isn't real." The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, it felt as if they were finally speaking the truth about their situation. James's expression softened for a brief second, his anger flickering, replaced by something else, something vulnerable. But before either of them could speak, Lily turned on her heel and stormed off, not caring where she went, just needing to get away. As the days passed, the tension between them only grew, and Lily's frustration turned to exhaustion. She had never imagined that marriage, even one born of desperation and necessity, would be this hard. But the hardest part was yet to come. One evening, she collapsed from exhaustion while working in the barn. The fever hit her quickly, and she found herself lying on the cold floor, shivering, her vision blurring. It wasn't long before James found her, his horse's hooves thundering through the dirt as he rode up to the barn. Without hesitation, he scooped her up in his arms and carried her back to the house. The next few days were a blur of fevered sleep and distant voices. When she woke, she found James sitting by her side, his face etched with worry. He had stayed with her, tending to her needs, something no one had done for him in years. She could see it in his eyes now. The vulnerability, the fear of losing her. It was a small crack in the walls he had built around his heart. And for the first time since their wedding, Lily began to wonder if there was more to this marriage than she had initially believed. But as James sat there, his eyes weary and his hand resting gently on hers, Lily couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't seeing her. He was seeing someone else, someone he had lost long ago. And as much as she wanted to believe that their marriage could be real, she wasn't sure if she was falling for the man in front of her or the ghost of his past. The weeks dragged on, each one filled with moments of brief connection followed by long periods of silence. Neither of them knew how to make this work, but both of them were trying in their own way. And as the days passed, Lily realized that something had shifted between them. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something, a spark, a flicker of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, their marriage could turn into something more than either of them had ever expected. As the weeks passed, Lily and James found themselves growing closer in ways neither of them had anticipated. At first, their interactions remained stiff and formal, each of them playing their parts as husband and wife out of obligation rather than affection. However, something subtle began to shift. Their dinners, once filled with awkward silences, began to be filled with actual conversation. James started teaching Lily how to ride better horses, a skill she had never mastered. And though his lessons were blunt, there was a kindness in the way he watched her struggle and slowly improve. Lily, in turn, started making his study feel warmer, organizing his books and papers, and finding small ways to make the grand, cold house feel more like a home. Rosa, ever the perceptive one, would watch them with knowing glances, offering sly comments about how the two of them seemed to be growing fond of each other. At first, both James and Lily denied it, dismissing it as nothing more than the inevitable effect of sharing the same space for so long. But deep down, neither could ignore the growing tension between them. The annual town dance was the first real test of their changing dynamic. James had been asked to accompany Lily, and while she had dreaded the idea of being the center of attention in front of the entire town, something about his presence calmed her nerves. As they entered the hall, the eyes of the townsfolk followed them, whispers swirling through the air, but James never once looked at anyone else. His gaze was fixed solely on Lily, a possessive, almost protective look in his eyes that sent a thrill through her. When the music began, he took her hand with surprising gentleness, leading her onto the dance floor. The first steps were awkward, their feet not quite in sync, but soon they fell into a rhythm, moving as if they had been dancing together for years. The other women in the room couldn't hide their envy, but Lily only had eyes for James. The way he held her, the way his hand rested firmly on her back, made her feel like she was the only person in the room. "You're beautiful tonight," he whispered, his voice low and sincere. And for the first time since their marriage, Lily felt seen, not as the woman who had been forced into this arrangement, but as herself, as Lily Hartwell. Her heart fluttered, and for a moment, the world outside of their little bubble ceased to exist. The town's gossip faded, and there was only the music, the light in James's eyes, and the way his hand held hers so securely. As the dance continued, their connection grew, and when the night ended, neither of them could deny the unspoken bond that had formed between them. Back at Hartwell Ranch, things shifted even further. Small touches became more frequent, his hand brushing against hers as they passed each other in the hall, the way their gazes lingered a moment too long before they looked away. It was as though they were both afraid to admit what was happening, afraid to acknowledge the attraction and connection that had begun to blossom between them. They were still bound by the contract, by the terms of their marriage of convenience, but something deeper was starting to grow. Yet, neither of them was ready to admit it. James, with his painful past, was too afraid to let anyone in, especially Lily, the woman who had brought his ghost of a heart back to life. Lily, on the other hand, was terrified of what it would mean to love a man who had once lost everything, a man who might only be seeing her as a replacement for his lost wife, Elizabeth. There were moments of closeness, of undeniable chemistry, but both held back. As time went on, they started to question whether their feelings for each other were real or simply the result of two people trapped in a lonely, unspoken arrangement. But then, something happened that neither of them had expected. The way James looked at Lily began to change. It was subtle at first, a flicker in his eyes whenever they spoke, a softness in his voice when he called her by her name. It was as though he had begun to see her, truly see her, as the woman she was, not as his debt, not as a substitute for his lost love, but as Lily Hartwell, his wife. That realization made Lily's heart race, but it also filled her with fear. What did it mean for her if she allowed herself to fall for him? What would it mean if James truly saw her, not as a business arrangement, but as someone he could love? The walls around their hearts began to crack, one small piece at a time, and neither of them knew how to stop the inevitable. And so, they continued to dance around the truth of their feelings, both afraid of the consequences of falling in love with someone who was supposed to be nothing more than a contractual obligation. But with every passing day, every lingering touch, every moment of shared laughter, the line between obligation and desire blurred until neither of them could tell where one ended and the other began. The tension that had been building between James and Lily finally reached a breaking point when Clayton Brennan, the same man who had humiliated them at the wedding reception, discovered the truth about their marriage. Clayton, always looking for a way to exploit others for his gain, had learned the details of their arrangement from a lawyer in town. The loophole in their contract was clear. The marriage had not been consummated, which meant it could be annulled at any time. Clayton saw an opportunity to swoop in, reclaim the land, and bring Lily's property back under his control. But to do that, he needed to expose their fake marriage. With a malicious joy only someone like Clayton could have, he spread the word through the town, fueling the already rampant gossip about their union. Whispers in the marketplace, in the church, and at the saloon grew louder as the people of the town began to turn on Lily. Some saw her as a gold digger, others as a victim trapped by circumstance. But no one saw her for who she truly was, a woman who had done what she had to in order to survive. The rumors stung, but it was the public humiliation that cut the deepest. Everywhere Lily went, she could hear the whispers, feel the eyes watching her, judging her. Even those who had once offered their sympathy now looked at her with a mix of suspicion and disdain. It was the worst kind of betrayal, not from James, but from the town that had once called her one of their own. James, for his part, remained distant, his anger boiling beneath the surface, but his inability to show any vulnerability only made things worse. His emotional walls, built over years of loss and grief, remained firmly in place, even as his feelings for Lily deepened. He watched the town turn on her, watched as she was dragged through the mud, and yet he said nothing, did nothing to protect her. Lily felt the weight of her decision pressing down on her, and for the first time since her father's death, she began to question whether she had made the right choice in marrying James. The marriage had begun as a business transaction, a means to an end, but it had turned into something far more complicated. And yet, as much as she had tried to distance herself from him, she found herself unable to escape the pull of her own emotions. She had come to care for him deeply, despite everything, the coldness, the distance, the walls he had built around his heart. And now, she couldn't help but wonder if it was all just a lie, if their connection, their growing closeness, had been nothing more than a way to fill the emptiness inside both of them. But the truth hit her like a blow when she overheard James in his study one evening. She had passed by the door, her footsteps light on the wooden floor, when she heard his voice, low and controlled, speaking to his lawyer. "One more month, and the contract expires. Then she's free," James said. Lily's heart sank. She stopped in her tracks, her breath caught in her throat. She didn't hear him continue, but the words were enough. She's free. That was what he thought of her. She wasn't his wife. She was just someone who had filled a temporary role, a means to an end. The thought hit her harder than she expected, and her chest tightened with hurt. For a moment, she thought she might turn around and leave him, leave everything behind, but she couldn't. She had made her bed, and now she had to lie in it. As much as she wanted to run, she couldn't escape the truth of her feelings for him, and that truth stung. Her pride wouldn't let her admit that she had fallen for a man who had never truly seen her, never truly wanted her. She couldn't bear the thought of being just another person in a long line of disappointments in his life. But as the days went on, the weight of her hurt grew heavier. Lily packed her belongings, deciding that she would leave before the contract expired, before James could cast her aside like everyone else. It wasn't a decision she made lightly, but she couldn't bear the thought of staying in a marriage that was nothing more than a lie. She couldn't live with the idea that she was just filling the space that Elizabeth had once occupied. She couldn't bear to be a substitute. As she stood in the stable, saddling her horse, preparing to leave, Rosa came to her with tears in her eyes. "What are you doing, child?" she asked gently, her voice filled with concern. "Leaving before he forces me out," Lily replied, her voice thick with emotion. She couldn't stay in a house that felt more like a prison every day. Rosa tried to stop her, but Lily wouldn't listen. She couldn't. She had already been humiliated enough. She couldn't let herself stay in a marriage that had never been real. But just as she was about to ride off, James appeared in the stable. His expression was one of confusion and concern, his voice desperate. "What are you doing?" he asked, his eyes searching hers. Lily could barely look at him. "Leaving before you throw me out." The words came out sharp, cutting through the silence between them. James's face fell, and for a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the horses and the soft rustling of the wind. "Throw you out? What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice trembling with confusion. "I heard you," Lily said, her voice shaking. "1 month, and I'm free. You can't wait to be rid of me." James's face changed in an instant, his eyes widening in horror. He stepped forward, blocking the stable door, his body tense. "You heard wrong," he said, his voice cracking. "I can't bear the thought of losing you. You think I'm counting down the days until you leave, but that's not it. I'm terrified. Terrified that you'll leave because I don't deserve you. Terrified that you'll stay out of obligation. And terrified that you'll leave because I'm falling in love with you." The words hit Lily like a wave, and for the first time since their marriage, she saw him. The real James Hartwell, not the cold businessman, not the grieving widower, but a man who was just as afraid of losing her as she was of being abandoned. Lily froze, her heart racing. The wall she had built around herself began to crumble as the truth of his words sank in. She had been so focused on her own hurt, so blinded by her pride, that she hadn't seen how much James had been suffering too. "I love you," he continued, his voice barely a whisper. "Not the contract, not the land. You. I love you, Lily. I have since that storm, maybe before." Tears welled in her eyes as she looked at him. The man who had been both her savior and her tormentor. The man who had built his empire on the ashes of his own grief, and yet had somehow managed to love her despite it all. "I love you too," Lily whispered, her voice breaking. "Why didn't you say something?" she asked, her voice filled with disbelief. James stepped closer, his hand reaching out to touch hers. "Because you deserve real choice. Not gratitude, not obligation. You deserve love. And I thought if I told you, I would only scare you away." But now, standing before her, he seemed to realize that he couldn't hold back any longer. "I was afraid of losing you," he admitted, his voice raw. "But I'm not afraid anymore. Please don't leave me, Lily. Please stay." The tears flowed freely now, and Lily's heart swelled with a love she had never expected to feel. This wasn't the man she had married. This wasn't the cold businessman who had bought her father's land. This was a man who had lost so much, but who had found something in her that he didn't know he was missing. And in that moment, Lily realized that she had found something too. Love, real love, that had grown between them despite the darkness, despite the contracts, despite everything that had happened. "I'm not going anywhere," she whispered, her voice filled with conviction. "Not anymore." They stood there in the dim light of the stable, the world outside forgotten, as they finally gave in to what they had both been avoiding for so long. And in that moment, everything changed. The legal battle that loomed over James and Lily had become inevitable. And despite the tentative peace they had found in their personal lives, the threat of Clayton Brennan's legal challenge was now at their doorstep. The entire town was buzzing with rumors, and the courthouse in Needham had never seen so many people gathered for a single event. The townsfolk, once divided in their opinions of Lily, now watched with bated breath, eager for the outcome of the case. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, and Lily could feel her heart racing in her chest as she stood with James in the crowded courthouse, surrounded by a sea of curious faces. Clayton had played his hand, and now it was time for James and Lily to prove that their love, if not their marriage, was real. Clayton's lawyer was the first to present their case, bringing up the points that had been causing so much turmoil for the couple. He began by showing evidence of the separate bedrooms. One of the servants had testified, stating that Lily and James had not shared a bed since their marriage. The lawyer also made much of the business nature of the marriage, producing the original contract between James and Lily, which clearly stated that their union was meant to be a temporary arrangement based on business interests, not love. The legal arguments seemed damning, and Lily could feel her resolve beginning to waver. Clayton's lawyer painted a picture of a woman who had married for convenience, and of a man who had used his wealth and power to control her. It was easy to see how the townspeople could believe it. After all, it was what they had been told all along. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't see, was the truth of James and Lily's relationship. They hadn't witnessed the late nights where James had stayed up just to be near her, the small moments when their hands had brushed and they hadn't pulled away, the growing tenderness in his eyes that had replaced the cold indifference. They hadn't seen how Lily had worked alongside him, building a life together from the ashes of their past mistakes. How her laughter had started to bring warmth to a house that had once been filled with silence. But they would have to. It was time for James to take the stand. He walked up to the front of the courtroom with his usual poise, but there was a weight to his step that Lily had never seen before. This was the moment of truth, and he knew it. As James began his testimony, the room fell into an almost suffocating silence. His voice was steady, but there was a vulnerability in it that he had never allowed anyone to see before. He admitted that the marriage had begun as a business arrangement, that he had asked Lily to marry him out of necessity, not love. But he didn't stop there. James spoke of his past, the loss of his first wife, Elizabeth, and how he had built his empire to shield himself from the pain. He talked about the emptiness he had felt since Elizabeth's death, and how he had been a ghost for years, focused solely on work, never allowing himself to feel anything for anyone again. But then he met Lily, and in her, he had found something he never expected: hope, love, a reason to live again. He looked directly at the judge, his eyes filled with emotion as he said, "I admit, I asked her to marry me for the land. But I stayed with her for who she is. I've fallen in love with her, and she's made me feel alive again. The contract was just paper. This marriage is real. I love her. I will always love her." The courtroom was dead silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air like a heavy cloud. Lily, who had been standing behind him, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, couldn't hold back her tears any longer. She had always known that James loved her, in his own way, but hearing him say it out loud, with such raw sincerity, made her heart swell. She realized then that their love, though born out of necessity, had blossomed into something beautiful, something undeniable. She couldn't let this man go, not now, not ever. When it was her turn to speak, She took a deep breath, steadying herself. She knew the world was watching, and she didn't want to fail him, not after everything they had been through. "I married James because I had no choice," she began, her voice trembling but steady. "But I stayed with him because I couldn't imagine my life without him. He's been my strength, my protector, my partner. And though our marriage started as a contract, it has become so much more. This isn't about land or power. It's about love. We've built a life together, and that life is real. This marriage is real." She paused, looking around the room, meeting the eyes of those who had once judged her. "You don't know what we've been through, what we've sacrificed to be here. But I know one thing for certain. We belong together, and I'm not going anywhere." When she finished speaking, the room remained silent for a long moment, and Lily felt as though the entire world had frozen. The judge, an older man who had witnessed many trials in his time, finally spoke, his voice grave. "Is this marriage real now, Mrs. Hartwell?" he asked, looking directly at Lily. She turned to James, her heart full, and then looked back at the judge. "More real than anything I've ever known," she replied, her voice unwavering. James, who had been standing beside her, stepped forward and placed his hand gently on her shoulder. "She's my wife," he said firmly, his voice resolute. "My partner, my heart. The contract was just paper. This is real." The judge nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Then I hereby declare your marriage valid," he said, his voice final. "The claim of Mr. Brennan is dismissed." The courtroom erupted into murmurs, but all Lily could hear was the sound of her own heartbeat racing in her chest. Clayton Brennan, who had been standing in the back, his face twisted with anger, was escorted out of the room by the sheriff. The crowd dispersed quickly, but Lily and James stood there, their hands intertwined, their hearts beating as one. They had won. The town had finally seen them for who they really were. Their love had triumphed over lies, over betrayal, and over fear. The legal battle was over, but their journey was far from complete. The next day, James surprised Lily with plans for a real wedding, one that wasn't just a formality, but a celebration of their love. He had arranged for the ceremony to take place at the church in Needham, the very church where they had first met. It was a simple affair, but it was everything Lily had ever wanted. She wore a white dress, one that James had chosen for her, and as they exchanged vows, the entire town watched with admiration. The vows they spoke this time were not about duty, not about obligation. They were about love. "I married you to save land," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "I marry you now to save myself. I love you, Lily Hartwell." Lily, tears in her eyes, responded, "I married you desperate and afraid. I marry you now joyful and certain. I love you, James Hartwell." Their kiss was not just a kiss of marriage. It was a kiss of freedom, of love, of everything they had fought for. The town erupted into applause, and for the first time since their wedding, Lily felt like she truly belonged. The reception that followed was filled with laughter, music, and dancing. The people who had once whispered behind her back now celebrated with her, and even Clayton's former allies found themselves cheering for the couple. Rosa, who had stood by them through everything, was there, her eyes filled with tears of joy. Moses, who had always believed in them, stood proudly by their side. The night was full of joy, but the real celebration came the following morning when James and Lily shared their first morning together as husband and wife, not out of obligation, but because they truly wanted to be together. "No more separate rooms," James whispered, his voice full of tenderness. Never again. Their love, which had begun as a transaction, had blossomed into something beautiful, something that neither of them had expected but both of them had needed. A year later, as they celebrated their first anniversary, Lily found herself pregnant with her first child. The ranch was thriving, the land flourishing with the hard work they had put into it. James, once a man consumed by grief, was now a man full of life, his eyes always shining when he looked at her. As they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset over their land, James wrapped his arm around her, his hand resting gently on her swollen belly. "How's our little one?" he asked, a soft smile on his lips. "Active. Stubborn, just like someone I know," Lily replied, laughing as she leaned into him. Together, they had built a life that neither of them had ever imagined, a life full of love, laughter, and hope. The past was behind them, and the future stretched out before them, bright with promise. As they rode to her father's grave the next day, Lily placed wildflowers on his resting place and whispered, "I kept my promise, Daddy. Didn't lose our home. Gained everything else." James, standing beside her, looked at the grave and smiled. "Think he'd approve?" he asked. "Of the stubborn rancher who blackmailed me into marriage and then fell hopelessly in love." Lily laughed, tears in her eyes. "Absolutely." They shared a kiss, and as they rode back to the ranch, the sun setting behind them, Lily knew that no matter what came their way, they would always have each other. They were home at last,